Today we're going to examine Westchester Education Services as a case study in creating, reviewing, and advising clients on culturally responsive materials. My name is Samantha Tucker, and I'm the Culturally Responsive Education Lead with Westchester Education Services. And Nilofer and Kevin, if you could introduce yourselves, please.
Sure. So I'm Kevin Gray. I'm the President and Chief Content Officer of Westchester Education Services, overseeing and consulting on work with the US and the UK. And Nilofer?
Hi, thank you, Sam and Kevin. I'm Nilofer Ali, and I am the Resources Manager for Westchester. I oversee the freelance talent pool, and another piece of my work is I manage or head up our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion initiative, and am heavily involved in our cultural responsive education reviews.
Thank you, Nilofer. Westchester has been involved in integrating the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion for a number of years. Can you give us an overview of the ways these principles are informing our work, Kevin?
Sure. So it's really in four areas. First, we realized that we needed to broaden and expand our recruiting, both in our freelance and staff. Publishing has been largely a homogenous arena, and we realized we needed to change that we had an opportunity to open the gates and change who was part of the publishing experience. We also are continually training our staff in how to develop culturally responsive materials. We've developed a process for reviewing publishers' backlists. A lot of publishers with a lot of material that's rather dated and presents material perhaps in a lopsided or one-sided way. And then finally, as we're building new material, we're looking for ways to apply the DEI principles as a differentiator for the kind of content we build.
Kevin touched on the need to revamp and recruit freelancers and staff in terms of diversity and equity inclusion. Nilofer, can you speak to diversity being an asset?
Oh, absolutely. Because we're creating material that reaches students in classrooms, we find it's the people from communities who are marginalized that understand best what change needs to happen as material reaches classrooms. So we look for people who have personal experiences as members of communities that have been historically marginalized in educational publishing and educational technology. And in addition, we look for those people who have an understanding of how identities intersect with and impact how people engage in the world. People who understand equity, bias, anti-racism, and accompanying concepts. So when we create space for communities to share their own voices, then on the student level, this provides students with opportunities to see themselves in the material they're interacting with, and that facilitates deeper engagement in their own learning. And students are able to have windows into the experiences of people from other cultures, which cultivates empathy.
So as we continually train staff and we draw from a diverse bank of authors, illustrators, contributors, how do we approach product development through a culturally responsive lens? And Nilofer, I think maybe you could best answer that.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what it looks like on the staff level. So when we're looking at developing content through the lens of cultural responsiveness, one of the best ways to do that is to really bring everyone on your staff, the people working on material, onto the same page with regard to equity and inclusion. And so in that, it has to start with leadership committing to these efforts and becoming educated about them, which is what we did. Kevin and I started on that road and expanded as we learned new things, expanded out to engage the rest of the staff. From there, we cement that work with structures, which include our rubric, our culturally responsive education rubric, as well as staff training, ongoing staff training. And finally, actually, one of the first things we did was we reached out into our networks to look for other people, other organizations and individuals who are working on diversity, equity, and inclusion to share ideas and partner with them.
Kevin, could you speak a little on the CRE review processes that Westchester has implemented, the develop of a rubric, teams, our overall process to review publisher materials and ensuring that they are culturally responsive?
Yeah, so as Nilofer noted, we see ourselves as part of a community. As we were having these conversations within the community, we had several publishers who came to us and said, we could really use an outside eye to look at our material, and the things that you're doing are in alignment with the things that we are doing or want to do. And so we worked to develop, as Nilofer said, a rubric, and I'll ask Nilofer to expand on that a little bit in a minute, but really drawing upon best practices to allow the publishers to see how their products overall map against some diversity lenses and diversity spectrums, and then also to identify the specific areas where there might be issues. And then we developed a pool of resources to do these reviews using this rubric. And so we always use 2 reviewers, or minimally 2 reviewers, to review the material. And we work with the publisher to come up with basically a thin slice, a small segment of the content that we can take a look at against the rubric with the reviewers and really calibrate understanding and expectation with the customer. So we might pick a chapter or a lesson and review that lesson. The reviewers calibrate, talk about what they've seen, what do they miss. If there are areas where there's some disagreement, we work to help come to a unified understanding. And then we do the same thing with the customer. And once we've done that, then we build that out for the rest of their material. And so we're doing that for a number of customers here in the U.S. and then and looking elsewhere to apply that. So Nilofer, do you want to talk about the rubric?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So before I do that, I want to just reemphasize something that Kevin mentioned, which is that in all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion work and culturally responsive education work, we draw upon the expertise and scholarship of educators and academics who have been researching and writing about these topics for decades. So our rubric helps our clients hone in on the specifics of where their content lies on the spectrum of cultural responsiveness. So that spectrum, as reflected on our rubric, spans 5 levels across 3 dimensions. The dimensions include things like who is centered in the material, whose perspective is presented, and the levels span from the lowest level, which we're calling obstructive, which centers the dominant cultural group and presents all things from that perspective. Our mid-level in our rubric is more supportive of different backgrounds, and it's one in which the foundation of the curriculum is still based in the narrative of that dominant group, but there's been significant and intentional inclusion of other maybe historically marginalized perspectives. Our highest level is the one in which historically marginalized cultures are affirmed and sustained, and equity and diversity is clearly the expectation throughout the material from its very foundation.
Thank you, Nilofer. Kevin, we're building our materials with the CRE and DEI lens. And what opportunities, in addition to clients' needs so far, are you finding in terms of CRE work, in terms of this DEI lens?
Yeah, so we've done some really interesting projects for some of our customers, starting with a series of readers that we developed that you can see behind me for the Latinx market. They were bilingual readers, and they were part of an ongoing series. This particular customer had retold Western tales for most of the series, and then came to us and said, look, we really want to tell the stories of the Latinx population. So we worked with writers and illustrators in Mexico and in parts of Central America. We've also developed some really neat programs for, there was a program we did for New York City schools that was focused on Black and Latino young men. And so, we wanted to make sure we were pairing authors who came from those communities to help develop the program. And are now in the process of building out a pretty extensive ELT program where we're teaching best practices in English language training. Or in English language teaching. We're doing a whole series of readers and workbooks and teacher materials with it. But what really differentiates it is looking at and drawing from stories of historically underrepresented communities, be it disability or race or ethnicity or gender, and trying to tell those stories while also working on the ELT piece. So the students who are learning English are also seeing themselves in the material.
Nilofer and Kevin, thank you so much for talking about this ongoing process. And Kevin and Nilofer have already noted, but I think it's important to note again, this really has been a community effort on our end. We've incorporated and considered and stand on the shoulders of many expert voices on the necessity of culturally responsive materials. And we welcome the opportunity to play that role for others. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Sam.
you.